Way back in 2021, Berlin passed a referendum calling on the state government to seize hundreds of thousands of rental apartments from big corporate landlords. The referendum was non-binding, so nothing really happened, but with state elections due this September and Die Linke, or the Left Party, topping the polls, it's suddenly back on the cards. So in this video, we're going to explain this plan to expropriate big landlords, and why it might actually happen. Sick of slop? Well, TLDR's content is entirely AI-free, with us having strict rules when it comes to the use of AI in our company. So, while we might not be perfect, at least you know we're human. Find our full AI policy linked in the description. So, to understand this story, you need to know a bit about how Germany's property market works. In short, unlike much of the rest of Europe, most Germans, especially in urban areas, don't own their homes. Rather, they rent them. According to the most recent Eurostat data, for instance, Germany has the lowest home ownership rate in the entirety of the EU, with just 47% of Germans owning their own home, compared to an EU average of 68%. And this figure falls to more like 20% in urban areas like Berlin and Dresden. Relatedly, this is the main reason that, while German salaries are pretty great by European standards, Germans aren't actually very wealthy, i.e. they don't own much in terms of assets. According to the most recent UBS wealth report, for instance, the median German owns just $53,000 worth of stuff, lower than any other country surveyed, including countries like Greece and Slovenia. This is essentially because Germans spend their money on rent rather than on paying off their mortgages, which is how most people build wealth. Now, in most of Germany, this system seems to work pretty well, and Germans seem pretty happy with it. This is in large part because tenants enjoy pretty robust legal protections, and thus don't suffer from the same insecurities as tenants in, say, the UK. Conversely, home ownership doesn't confer the same tax advantages as it does in other countries, and government policy has historically focused more on ensuring a sufficient supply of rental housing rather than boosting home ownership rates. Again, this is very much unlike the UK, where mass home ownership has been seen by successive governments as essentially a policy objective in its own right. However, one place where this system doesn't seem to work so well is Berlin, where rental prices have been skyrocketing since really the early 2010s. To be clear, in absolute terms, rents in Berlin aren't that bad. It's still cheaper than, say, London or Paris. Rather, it's the rate of increase that makes Berlin an international outlier. Rent effectively doubled between 2008 and 2018, while wages only rose by about 30% over the same time period. The root cause of this crisis was pretty simple. Lots of people were moving to Berlin, but the city wasn't building enough houses to keep up. In fact, between 2008 and 2018, the population grew at roughly 5 times the construction rate. However, the crisis was, at least in the eyes of many Berliners, exacerbated by corporate landlords, who play an outsized role in Berlin's housing market relative to the rest of Germany, and were accused of exploiting the crisis by buying up units and squeezing tenants. In this context, in 2018, activists launched the Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen & Co. initiative, named after Berlin's largest landlord, and calling for the seizure of all apartments owned by corporate landlords with housing portfolios above a 3,000 unit threshold. This would have affected something like 250,000 apartments, or about 15% of Berlin's entire rental stock, which campaigners suggested could then be placed into a new publicly owned housing institution that would guarantee affordable rents and involve tenants in its governance. According to a draft bill written up by campaigners, developers would apparently be compensated at 40 to 60% of market rates, and Berlin would pay for this by issuing 100-year bonds paying 3.5% annually. Anyway, under Berlin law, if an initiative gets at least 20,000 signatures from eligible Berlin voters, and campaigners can provide a plausible estimate of its cost, the initiative then goes to the Berlin Parliament, who can accept or reject it. If the Parliament doesn't adopt the initiative, which is what happened with Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen & Co. initiative, then the campaigners need to get signatures from 7% of eligible voters within 4 months to force a referendum. In 2021, this amounted to roughly 171,000 signatures, and, well, the campaigners were able to get about 184,000 valid signatures, thus forcing a referendum on September the 26th, 2021, the same day as the federal and Berlin state elections. In the end, the referendum passed, with 57.6% of voters voting in favour of it. Interestingly, however, lots of Berliners supported both the expropriation initiative and the centre-left SPD, even though the SPD was generally sceptical of the proposal. This produced a somewhat contradictory mandate. Berliners approved the referendum, but elected an SPD-led coalition supported by the Left Party and the Greens that didn't really want to enact it. Because initiative referendums in Germany are generally non-binding, this meant that nothing actually happened. This was sort of the worst of both worlds. The state didn't get a new stock of affordable public housing, but the threat of expropriation deterred developers from building more housing, and rental prices have continued to rise since. However, ahead of state elections due for September the 20th, the Left Party, who are in favour of the proposal, are currently topping the polls on about 21%, while the SPD have fallen to 5th place on about 12%. It's hard to predict what the next ruling coalition will look like with any real confidence, but it's at least possible that the Left and the Greens, who also support the proposal and are currently polling on about 17%, could win an outright majority between them, especially if BSW and the FDP fall behind the 5% vote threshold. Even if this doesn't happen, and they instead form another three-party coalition with the SDP, the balance of power within this coalition would obviously be very different to the one in 2021. And even if the SPD were somehow able to stymie the proposal again, it still might happen. Under Berlin law, if the campaigners can organise and win another referendum, the proposal would automatically become law. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that, if this were to happen, it would almost definitely end up in the courts. The campaigners would argue that expropriation would be legal under Article 15 of Germany's 1949 constitution, which states that land, natural resources and means of production may, for the purposes of socialisation, be transferred into public ownership or other forms of public enterprise by a law that determines the nature and extent of compensation. But Article 15 has never actually been tried before, and the federal government, led by the right-wing CDU, has made it clear it would oppose any attempt at expropriation, setting the stage for a monumental battle in the Constitutional Court. The autumn issue of our magazine Too Long is now available for pre-order. The main story inside is all about the plan to fix Europe. From the economy and trade to politics and war, we discuss the various ways in which Europe could be reborn. Then there's the global section, which includes our interview with The Economist's Washington bureau chief about the state of America. There's also articles on the current state of US-China relations, as well as discussing the politics of disasters, the Pope's involvement in 21st century politics, and the death of the dollar. Our EU section includes the latest from the war in Ukraine, how Germany's rearmament could defend Europe, as well as stories from across the continent. Our UK section unpacks Britain's new Prime Minister, as well as the various rumbling issues from Brexit, some 10 years on, that still plagued Burnham. That's just some of the stories in this issue, with us also launching a brand new business section to go alongside the relaunch of TLDR Business YouTube channel later this month. If you're interested in hearing our takes on all of those topics, then you can get the very best deal by subscribing to Too Long. Subscribers get 20% off every issue as long as they're subscribed, but if you use code AUGUST26, you'll get an additional £3 off your first copy. Plus, if you want the most from TLDR, then you can also subscribe to Too Long and TLDR Party in one bundle, the cheapest way to get both subscriptions. Regardless, thank you so much for watching this video and for supporting TLDR.